as we go beyond the Beyond Fast announcement from Nvidia, we start to see a whole bunch of additional details given out to the press. And while I'm not at GTC myself, I've been scouring the news for the most interesting information. So we've got a bunch of stories to talk about today, but I think the main one, at least for me, is I'm still fascinated by DLSS 3. I did my video talking about how I worry a little bit about the latency. And to be clear, and I'll talk more about that here, I think that that's only going to be an issue really in ultra competitive type situations where you really want to get that increased FPS. I think this could, as long as it looks good, still be a fantastic feature for games where the, absolute every little millisecond of response time isn't quite so crucial. So I think some people felt maybe I was being a little too negative there. I just was trying to highlight a latency issue, but not say that it actually kills my excitement for DLSS 3. And this actually really interests me today, where apparently Nvidia has demonstrated, and we'll get more of these details here, an RTX 4090 running Cyberpunk 2077, but this time it's actually giving a lot of the stats of how the GPU is running, including both its clock speeds and its power consumption. And it's extremely interesting that when they enable DLSS 3, by the way, this is also going to give us some performance figures with DLSS 3 disabled. Finally, we haven't really had a lot of that to compare to, so this is an interesting story here. Anyway, when they kicked on DLSS 3, the power draw, and I believe this was being measured from the wall of the system, actually dropped by 25%, although the GPU was still reporting at full utilization and clocking over 2800 megahertz. And apparently this was at stock, and the temperatures were around 50 Celsius when the DLSS 3 was enabled, and I think around 55 Celsius when it was not enabled, when it was running at native resolution. Now let's dig into this, because this also, I believe, had some 1440p performance numbers, which is still a more popular resolution than 4K, although if you're buying in the 4090 class, I mean, some people would definitely go the extremely high refresh rate 1440p. Some people would be going 4K these days. I think it would be a little more common to go 4K than in the typical, just overall PC market. So this is WCCF Tech, and all my articles will be linked in my description today, reporting that they demonstrated the RTX 4090 Founders Edition paired with an Intel Core i9-12900K running Cyberpunk 2077 using, now this is interesting too, this is ultra ray tracing and psycho settings. This is a big deal because so far all of the Cyberpunk benchmarks we've seen given by Nvidia were for the new upcoming RT Overdrive mode, which does not exist yet for other people, just playing Cyberpunk. And why this matters is because we can do more apples to apples comparisons. In other words, you could actually run the game at these settings on your GPU to get an idea for the performance. Now anyway, this is the maximum settings of Cyberpunk as it currently exists, not the new RT Overdrive mode. And at the native resolution, 1440p, so without DLSS and reflex, the game was running at an average of 59 frames per second. Now, it doesn't tell us what scene of the game this was, so that's a huge wild card, because some scenes of the game are way more demanding than others. But anyway, it is a performance number, averaging 59 FPS with 49 FPS 1% lows, while looking at a fixed frame and a latency of 72 to 75 milliseconds. The latency matters when we look into kicking on the new DLSS mode. Now, again, this is kind of a big deal, because I think some people might be disappointed to see that Cyberpunk at 1440p at its current maximum settings with all of the ray tracing bells and whistles, but not even RT Overdrive mode, still isn't actually hanging out consistently above 60 FPS, and this is at 1440p, not 4K. So interesting. However, that is still much, much faster than current generation hardware. I'm going to skip a little bit ahead in this article to where they gave the WCCF Tech authors of this article, where did they put it? They had their RTX 3090 Ti as a performance comparison. that they jumped in with themselves here. Here was their update. So they updated this article. And so this is WCCF Tech. So this is not claiming they're on the same system here. But what they're saying is that they took their RTX 3090 Ti, which is not a Founders Edition. It's an MSI Supreme, if we go by the Gamers Nexus pronunciation, design, which has a small, a factory overclock. So keep that in mind. But they're saying that when they ran it at that same scene, because they were at this presentation, so they know the scene that was being tested. So at the same settings, at 1440p native in the same scene on their 3090 Ti, they were getting 37.2 frames per second. So while maybe the overall performance, we're seeing reported there on that 4090 in that scene isn't super high, it is significantly faster, although not double, the 3090 Ti. This is also in a ray tracing mode, so keep that in mind because this is not necessarily indicative of what we'll see in rasterized performance mode. Anyway, let's jump back into more of these stats. So at those settings, the GPU was running over 2.8 gigahertz. And again, this seems to be at stock settings with a 100% utilization. And the Founders Edition coolers seem to be keeping this between 50 to 55 Celsius. Now, I'm taking this author's word for it that this was at stock because, I mean, could Nvidia have cranked the fans up really high to keep these cooler temps and help and clocked things up? I mean, I guess, but this is being stated as at stock, so I'm gonna have to trust the authors here that they do know what they're talking about here. So anyway, that's significantly higher than the boost clock that is the official spec. And that's really interesting, and it does, again, confirm that NVIDIA's claimed that they've been able to overclock over 3 gigahertz with these cards. And so if it's boosting up over 2800 just at stock settings on the Founders Edition, I think, AIB partner cards with better cooling, higher power limits, all of that, going past 3 gigahertz sounds pretty reasonable if this is the case. Of course, is this some kind of golden sample? Who knows? It's an NVIDIA presentation, but so anyway, now then they kick on DLSS 3. So they are noting that this is a pre-release version of DLSS 3 and all of that. So who knows, final release could do better or whatnot. But the point is, they kicked on DLSS frame generation, and thank goodness they actually used the quality preset, because another one of my frustrations with what we've seen from a lot of the benchmarks we've been seeing from NVIDIA officially is that they use DLSS at the performance mode. And while performance mode is really impressive at what it does, upscaling from 1080p to 4K, it does not look as good as native 4K or even as good as DLSS at something like the quality preset, at least from what I've seen on DLSS 2. Anyway, so I use an RTX 3080 12GB as my daily gaming GPU, and I play at 4K, and I use quality a lot. But I don't usually go below that setting unless absolutely necessary, which isn't common on the 3080. Anyway, so at the quality preset, again, this is at 1440p DLSS quality with the DLSS 3, and this does have the frame generation where okay, so more on that. So some people were questioning whether they really have to generate the full next frame to insert the frame in between, and that impacts on the latency. So I don't think they have to generate the full next frame at its full resolution. I think they just need some of that next frame buffer data in order to have the AI there. So that's why I think this is so. Again, in my latency video, I think a lot of people were saying, so this is just like TV's motion smoothing. And I compared it to that in that video. But to be clear, I think because of the access the GPU has to motion vectors predicting where things are going, as well as the next frame's buffer of some of its information, it can do a much better job, both quicker and more accurate than what a TV's motion smoothing type algorithm would do. So anyway, I do want to mention that. Anyway. So using the quality preset with DLSS 3 with the frame generation mode, at quality, it bumped all the way up to 170 FPS on average. My heater just kicked on and I don't have time to turn it off or refilm or edit this video, so sorry guys, there'll be some background noise. Maybe I should kick on RTX voice. Anyway, boost to 170 FPS. Keep in mind, that's from 59 FPS average to 170 FPS average at the quality setting. But again, some of those are those AI inserted frames that aren't actually rendered by the engine. Interesting. The 1% lows go up to 119 FPS, and the average latency went to 53 milliseconds. So keep in mind, when I say that DLSS 3 increases latency, I don't mean compared to off versus on. That's not what I mean. This does decrease latency. So compared to that earlier, latency measurement we were getting at the native resolution, I forget exactly where it was. It was up here somewhere. We had 72 to 75 milliseconds of latency. And by the way, we're not talking frame pacing latency. We're talking input latency to output, I think, as measured with the Nvidia reflex kind of stuff. Anyway, so we're seeing a reduction in latency by turning on DLSS. So what I mean is, I think that if you compare DLSS 3 plus reflex to DLSS 2 plus reflex, I think DLSS 2 plus reflex might have less latency. Or another way of putting it is, I think if you compared this frame rate rendered natively plus reflex to this frame rate rendered with DLSS 3 plus reflex, I'm just saying that I think there is an introduction of latency from the DLSS 3 frame generation, which is then compensated for by reflex, which you could use again without DLSS 3 to get an even further reduction in latency, right? And then increasing the frame rate through the normal, because I don't think DLSS 3 just generates new frames. It still does what DLSS 2 does, of reduce the input resolution and upscale, which does get you more real frames too, which also helps decrease latency. So I do want to make sure I'm clarifying all of that for my last video, because I think I said that stuff, but focused in on the latency increase, and some people took a more negative look at that than I maybe intended. So overall, the again, really interesting thing here was that when they kicked on DLSS 3, the GPU's wattage dropped to 348 watts from 461 watts. And this was being measured using a PCAT tool to provide the wall. So, to provide that power number. So this should be accurate. Anyway, the point is, I'm really interested in how it's reducing the power draw, because that's really surprising to me, because if it's still 100% utilizing the GPU, at least it was reported as 100% utilization, how could it be using less power? I mean, it's shifting work over to the tensor cores for sure. And the RT cores are doing a lot here. So, I mean, I guess the tensor cores are running at more power efficiency, but then if it's still utilizing all of the normal shader units, I don't know, guys. Seems a bit strange, but that's what happened. So that's exciting if you're going to be using DLSS 3, which seems to be NVIDIA's big new feature they want to push. Anyway, if you want to compare what the WCCF Tech folks got on their 3090 Ti, which can run DLSS 2, they gave us some power numbers, but they don't give us the latency performance, which would be interesting, but I guess they were not able to pull those measurements here. So it is showing that at the native 1440p resolution, the 4090 versus what WCCF Tech's 3090 Ti was able to do is a 62% faster at these same settings. And it looks like with DLSS 2 versus DLSS 3, the 4090 is now 178% faster. But again, it has that DLSS 3 advantage with the frame generation. So we can definitely see why NVIDIA is wanting to compare with DLSS 3 enabled. And honestly, as long as it works really well, I think there's going to be a lot of games, like a ray tracing heavy game like Cyberpunk, I think is going to look really good. And if you get your frame rate high enough that the real frames that aren't frame generated are a high enough frame rate that your input latency already feels good, the extra frame generation will just help the output image look smoother, and you'll still have good input latency. So again, I want to be clear, I am excited about this feature. I just wanted to make sure we're real about that frame generation and its potential drawbacks, and that some of those frames are not all created equal when it comes to the actual input latency gain you would normally get from a real frame, input latency reduction you would get from real frames. Now, Nvidia is also showing off Cyberpunk 2077 ray tracing overdrive mode. And this, I think, is at 4K and whatnot, and highlighting a bunch of other frames. This video is going long, and I actually have to get to work. Some of you guys are probably new to my channel due to these new GPU launches. I'm a high school teacher. I do this channel as a hobby, although it is kind of taking off, which is cool. But I do actually have to get to work in a few minutes here. The point is, though, they're showing off some actual performance numbers. So in the past, we've seen slides with the relative performance, like we're seeing here, like 1x to 2x performance in a variety of games, and showing the DLSS 3 performance multiplier, which is what this is showing off. But they're also giving us an actual frame rate number here, which is interesting in a variety of games. So there you go, although I think we're back to 4K again and all of that. So it was really interesting to get some of that 1440p data and some native and some actual comparisons. Let me run through the rest of my articles a lot quicker. We've seen more information coming out. I believe this is coming from Ryan Smith from Anantech. Is it Anantech? Something like that. The point is we're getting a bunch of the transistor counts confirmed by Nvidia for the various GPUs. So like the 80, 102, 103, and 104. And it actually is that even though our, the RTX 3080 12 gigabyte, which everybody feels like was probably a 3070 or 3070 Ti initially, but it is called a 3080, is on the 8104, whereas usually a 3080 would be on your top-end SKU. Like that's what we saw, the 3080s were on the top-end SKU. But the 8104 chip does have more transistors than the GA102. That's like our 3090s, 3080s chip that produces those. So it does have more transistors, but a bunch of them are dedicated to things like the L2 cache, and we have, again, more of these tensor and ray tracing units and things like that. Although the overall ROPS, which would imply rasterized operation, right? This is like render operation performance, whatever, but should help actual rasterization performance is still looking fairly high here. But anyway, so the die sizes and actual transistor counts are available here. But like I said, I got to get to work, so we're going to do the fast version of the rest of this video. Hey, we saw an MSI RTX 4090 gaming trio at Newegg, listed at $1599, and I think this was showing up as a back order available. So we're at least seeing something besides a Founders Edition listing at its actual MSRP, although that MSRP is very high. Anyway, we're seeing the RTX 40 series PCIe Gen5 power adapters. So your power supply probably has 8-pin connectors that are going to have to go into an adapter and then plug into the little PCIe 5.0 adapter that actually goes into the video card. Anyway, it looks like they have a limited connect and disconnect life rated at 30 cycles, which seems really low. That's literally like unplug and plug it back in 30 times and you're past its rated lifespan. Although I think if I'm correct here, if I had more time, I'd dig into it further. I think a lot of cable connections are actually rated at a fairly low cycle number like this, but they actually work just fine previously, so I wouldn't panic too much here. Although people like me who swap GPUs out a lot for testing, that would be concerning if it really did start having issues after just 30 cycles. Now, a lot of places like WCCF Tech, but I've seen this reported elsewhere, are claiming that AMD has just reduced their official MSRPs, and that is not true. But what they did do was highlight, what they released was this, but notice that this is not a new MSRP list. It's just showing their price at Newegg against the competition. And they are highlighting that their price at Newegg versus the competition is significantly better, and that shouldn't be news to anybody on my channel, as I've been reporting that the AMD competition, if you're willing to take this loss in feature set and things like that, you get a lot of just straight up rasterized performance for your dollar compared to the Nvidia counterparts. AMD is playing that up, but I want to correct all the articles saying that this is a new MSRP. That is not what this says. This does not say this is a new MSRP. With the new CPUs coming out, don't forget about that. With the new GPU launches, we're also getting new CPUs. We're seeing some benchmarks showing off some fast performance on the 13900K with the now fastest passmark score in single threading. And we're also seeing the 7950X from AMD breaking some 4 HWBot world records with an AIO cooler, which is interesting. Again, I don't have a lot of time to dwell on the details here. Gotta get to work, but all my sources will be in the description. We're also seeing that Ryzen 9 7950X overclocked to 7.2 gigahertz on a single core, 6.5 gigahertz across all cores, but this is using LN2, so that's more just for, setting records, not for daily use. Interesting to see, though. We're also seeing Scorn saying, developers on Twitter saying that they will support direct storage on PC. So direct storage is another one of these upcoming technologies that I'm excited to see coming out into the wild soon and get tested. So this should speed up the connection between like game assets and your GPU without slowing down so much through CPU draws, which I'm hoping will help out some performance in some of the bigger open world games and with ray tracing. Now, a couple of interesting things here. Okay, maybe I should lead with this. So back on September 17th, it was reported that we've seen mods where FSR is modded into games that have DLSS support by replacing the DLL files. But then we saw some games like Judgment come out with FSR but not DLSS. So the same modders were asked, could you reverse the process? And they did. They were able to mod DLSS into a game that was just FSR 2.0. To be clear, I'm talking FSR 2.0. And that was in the game Judgment. And so they were able to replace DLSS, replace FSR with DLSS. Interesting. However, now we're seeing that Judgment has been updated to its 1.001 version, which added an FSR 2.1, which is fantastic. Although do note that it has, at least for now, broken the DLSS mod. I wonder if we'll see it repaired. And I don't think that was the reason this happened. I think the game was just being updated to 2.1, which is great, and I'm glad to see that happening. But apparently it does break the DLSS mod, so be aware. Also, if you're wondering about pricing, has the new Nvidia announcements and the crypto, Ethereum was, actually moved to proof of stake. All Ethereum mining is currently unprofitable on every GPU. You can take a look at Hardware Unboxed latest video. I just watched it this morning, and they're monitoring GPU prices, and it looks like we haven't seen a huge crash in either the used or new market yet at this point. But you could take a look at their video for some more of those details. I'll link it in the description. And we're seeing the Steam Deck OS beta update introducing docked mode fixes and some frame pacing improvements. By the way, guys, I bought a Steam Deck. I'm imagining I'll put up some sort of content related to the Steam Deck after I've had more time to play around with it and get some full thoughts. Anyway, so they added external display output resolution refresh rate selection UI in display settings and automatically avoid problematic resolutions and such, improve frame pacing when compositing, such as when FSR is enabled, a whole bunch of other little fixes, so that's interesting. And I have seen rumors that the long-awaited Steam Deck official dock, there's a lot of third-party docks, might actually be finally seeing the light of day soon-ish. But we'll see. And I will also mention that AMD's software Adrenalin 22.9.1 is out, and that has support for Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 Open Beta, so you might want to download that if you're playing in the Open Beta. Speaking of which, last night, which I don't usually publish videos at night, I did publish a GTX 1060, tested out in the Call of Duty Open Beta. I've also filmed my 3080, but I didn't want to publish both at the same time. That could mess with the YouTube algorithm, but I did publish that to my channel members. Huge thank you to channel members, by the way. I don't say that often enough. You can click the join button down there, and the main thing I offer you, other than, I do see your comments easier and try to respond to them more often, just because they get highlighted for me. And then also, I do give early access to videos that I don't want to publish yet and things like that. So anyway, that is available to channel members, and it's a good way to support me, because I've got to buy a lot of expensive new GPUs, guys, because I do want to test them out on the channel. I hope all of you have an excellent day.